In the heart of ancient Rome, where marble columns pierced the sky and emperors commanded legions, there existed women who wielded power beyond imagination, yet lived under a shadow of terror that would make seasoned gladiators tremble. These were the Vestal Virgins, the most sacred priestesses of the Roman world, guardians of a flame that could never be allowed to die. Picture this: while ordinary Roman women remained property of their fathers or husbands, the Vestals walked freely through the forum. Senators stepped aside for them, emperors sought their blessings, they owned property, made wills, and commanded respect that even patrician men could only dream of. When a Vestal Virgin appeared at the Colosseum, condemned criminals could be pardoned with a simple gesture. Their word could overturn death sentences. They were living goddesses in a world that worshipped power. But this divine status came with a price so terrifying that it defied human comprehension. Within the sacred temple of Vesta, an eternal flame flickered, a symbol of Rome's very soul. Should this fire ever extinguish, Romans believed their empire would crumble to ash. The responsibility for maintaining this flame rested entirely upon 6 young women, chosen as children and bound to serve for 30 years of their lives. These weren't ordinary priestesses. They were selected from Rome's most noble families, often between the ages of 6 and 10, torn from their childhood to serve a goddess who demanded absolute perfection. Their white robes symbolized purity. Their elaborate hairstyles marked them as brides of Vesta herself. Every movement was watched, every action scrutinized, every breath monitored by a society that had elevated them to near divine status. Yet here lies the most chilling paradox of their existence. The very society that worshipped them as living deities would destroy them with unimaginable cruelty if they showed even the slightest human weakness. The same Romans who bowed before them in reverence would become their executioners without hesitation. For in Rome's twisted logic, to be sacred meant to be inhuman, and to be human meant to face punishment so brutal that death would seem like mercy. The Vestal Virgins lived in a gilded cage of privilege and terror, honored above all women, yet haunted by the knowledge that a single mistake, a moment of human frailty, or even a false accusation could transform them from revered priestesses into victims of Rome's most savage justice. They were untouchable, both blessed and cursed by their sacred status. What awaited those who failed in their duties wasn't simply death. It was something far more sinister, designed by minds that understood how to weaponize both reverence and revulsion. The punishments that befell fallen Vestal Virgins reveal Rome at its most calculating, most cruel, and most hypocritical, an empire that claimed to honor purity while perfecting the art of destroying those who embodied it. At the moment a young girl was chosen to become a Vestal Virgin, her childhood died. Led to the Temple of Vesta by the Pontifex Maximus himself, she would speak words that would define every breath she took for the next 3 decades. I dedicate myself to the goddess Vesta to maintain the sacred fire and to remain pure in thought, word, and deed. Pure. That single word contained within it the seeds of terror that would haunt her every waking moment. For 30 years she would be forbidden from experiencing love, intimacy, or even the simple human connection of romantic affection. This wasn't merely celibacy, it was total emotional and physical isolation from half of human experience. While other Roman women married, bore children, and lived as wives and mothers, the Vestals existed in a state of perpetual virginity that Romans believed was essential to maintaining divine favor. But how does one police purity? How does a society ensure that its sacred women remain untainted by human desire? Rome had developed a system of surveillance so comprehensive, so invasive, that it would make modern authoritarian states seem naive. The Vestals lived together in the House of the Vestals, their every movement observed by servants, guards, and each other. They couldn't be alone with men. They couldn't venture out without escorts. Even their conversations were monitored for signs of improper thoughts or desires. The psychological toll was devastating. Imagine living every day knowing that a single glance held too long, a conversation that strayed toward personal topics, or even dreams that your mind conjured without permission could be interpreted as evidence of impurity. The weight of representing Rome's divine protection crushed the spirits of women who had never been allowed to discover who they might have been as individuals. Yet perhaps most cruel was the arbitrary nature of their vulnerability. In a society where political enemies sought any weapon to destroy their rivals, Accusations against Vestal virgins became tools of political warfare. A whispered rumor, a planted piece of evidence, testimony from a slave tortured into confession, any of these could transform a revered priestess into a condemned criminal overnight. The Romans had convinced themselves that the purity of these women was so powerful, so essential to their survival, that even the suspicion of impurity could bring divine wrath upon the entire empire. Military defeats, plagues, famines, earthquakes, all could be blamed on a Vestal virgin who had supposedly broken her vow. The logic was circular and inescapable. If Rome suffered, someone must pay, and who better than the women whose entire purpose was to prevent such suffering? Living under this impossible standard broke many of them psychologically long before any formal accusation was made. Some became fanatically devoted to their duties, transforming into hollow-eyed zealots who policed their own thoughts with religious fervor. Others grew bitter and withdrawn, counting the years until their service ended, and they could finally live as human beings rather than symbols. But for those who were accused, whether guilty or innocent, the knowledge of what awaited them was perhaps the cruelest torture of all. They had spent their lives surrounded by privilege, honored and revered, treated as living goddesses. They understood better than anyone the heights from which they would fall. They knew that the same hands that had once offered them gifts and prayers would soon applaud their destruction. The vow of chastity wasn't simply about sexual purity, it was about the complete surrender of human agency to serve as a living embodiment of Roman values. And when those values demanded a sacrifice, these sacred women would discover that their elevated status made their fall not just possible, but inevitable. When a Vestal virgin was condemned for breaking her sacred vow, Rome faced a theological crisis that required the most twisted form of creative justice. They could not simply execute her. To spill the blood of a sacred priestess would bring divine curse upon the empire, yet she could not live, for her impurity threatened to extinguish the favor of the gods. The solution they devised was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty: entombment alive. The ritual began at dawn, when Rome's streets lay empty and silent. The condemned Vestal was brought from her cell, no longer wearing the white robes of her sacred office, but dressed instead in the dark garments of the dead. Her hair, once elaborately styled to mark her divine status, hung loose and disheveled. She was already being treated as a corpse, though her heart still beat and her lungs still drew breath. The procession moved through the city in absolute silence. No crowds gathered to watch. This wasn't a spectacle for public entertainment like the gladiatorial games. This was sacred business, too terrible and too holy for common eyes. Only the highest religious officials, the Pontifex Maximus, and select witnesses accompanied the doomed woman on her final journey. Even her footsteps were muffled, as if Rome itself conspired to erase her existence before it was complete. They led her to a place called the Campus Sceleratus, the field of crime. A barren ground outside the city walls reserved for this most unholy of holy rituals. Here, slaves had already prepared her tomb, a small underground chamber, barely large enough for a person to lie down, accessible only through a narrow opening that could be sealed with stone and earth. The chamber itself was a monument to Rome's theological cowardice. They provided her with a small lamp filled with oil, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, and a bed with covers. These weren't acts of mercy, they were carefully calculated to salve Rome's collective conscience. See, they could tell themselves, we didn't murder her. We gave her food and drink and warmth. If she dies, it's the will of the gods, not our doing. But every Roman present understood the hideous mathematics of this provision. The oil would last perhaps a day, casting dancing shadows on the earthen walls until darkness claimed her completely. The bread might sustain her for 3 or 4 days if she rationed it carefully. The water, perhaps a week if she disciplined herself to tiny sips. Then would come the slow, agonizing process of starvation in absolute darkness, alone with her thoughts and the terrible knowledge that above her head, life continued while she slowly faded into nothing. As she descended into the chamber, sometimes willingly, maintaining her dignity to the end, sometimes dragged by servants when terror overcame her resolve, the witnesses would speak the ritual words absolving Rome of her murder. The gods will decide her fate, they intoned, though everyone present knew exactly what that fate would be. The opening was sealed with a massive stone, then covered with earth until no trace remained of the chamber beneath. What happened next existed only in the imagination of those who walked away, but that imagination was haunted by terrible certainty. In the first hours, she might have prayed, recited the sacred words she had spoken for decades, called upon Vesta to either save her or take her quickly. Perhaps she ate a small portion of bread, drank a careful sip of water, tried to make her provisions last. But as the oil burned lower and the darkness closed in, as the air grew thick and stale, as hunger gnawed at her belly and thirst cracked her lips, the psychological torment would have become unbearable. The woman who had once walked freely through Rome's greatest temples, who had commanded respect from senators and emperors, who had lived as a goddess among mortals, now lay dying in a hole in the ground like a discarded animal. The cruelest aspect of this punishment was its privacy. Gladiators died before cheering crowds, their suffering transformed into entertainment and glory. Criminals were crucified on roadsides, their agony serving as public warning. But the Vestal virgins died alone, their screams heard by no one, their suffering witnessed only by the earth that pressed down upon their tomb. This was how Rome honored its most sacred women, by burying them alive and pretending the gods had chosen their fate. Not all condemned Vestal virgins faced the horror of live burial. Some endured a punishment designed to destroy not just their bodies, but their very identity as sacred beings, public scourging and ritual humiliation that transformed revered priestesses into objects of shame and disgust. The flogging of a Vestal virgin wasn't a simple beating. It was a carefully orchestrated ceremony of degradation that began long before the first lash touched her skin. She was stripped of her sacred white robes, the very garments that had marked her as divine, and dressed in the rough, dirty tunic of a common slave. Her elaborately styled hair, once a symbol of her consecration to Vesta, was cut short or shaved completely, leaving her scalp bare and vulnerable. But the physical preparation was nothing compared to the psychological torture that preceded it. Roman officials would spend hours, sometimes days, interrogating her about her supposed crimes. They demanded details of imagined liaisons, forced her to confess to acts that may never have occurred, and insisted she name accomplices who may not have existed. The woman who had once been consulted by emperors on matters of state now found herself subjected to the crude questions of men who delighted in stripping away her dignity one humiliating word at a time. When the actual scourging began, it often took place in the basement chambers of official buildings, hidden from public view but witnessed by carefully selected audiences of religious authorities and government officials. These weren't random spectators, they were Rome's elite, the very men who had once bowed their heads in her presence. Now they watched with fascination as the sacred became profane before their eyes. The instrument of punishment was typically a flagrum, a whip with multiple leather strands, sometimes embedded with pieces of bone or metal. Each strike was calculated to inflict maximum pain while avoiding permanent disfigurement that might interfere with any subsequent execution ritual. The number of lashes was determined by complex religious formulae, designed to match the severity of her supposed crimes against divine law. But the physical pain, excruciating as it was, paled beside the psychological agony of her transformation. With each lash, she was reminded that her sacred status had been nothing more than a collective delusion that Rome could withdraw at will. The men who struck her were the same officials who had once sought her blessings. The hands that raised the whip had once offered her gifts and reverence. Some Vestals broke completely under this treatment, screaming confessions to crimes they had never committed, begging for mercy from men who had already decided her fate. Others maintained a terrifying dignity, enduring the scourging in silence, their eyes fixed on some distant point as if they could transcend their physical suffering through sheer force of will. The aftermath was perhaps most cruel of all. Unlike other criminals who might recover from their beatings and eventually rejoin society, the scourged Vestal faced a kind of social death. She could never return to her sacred duties. Her violation had made her permanently unclean in Roman eyes. But neither could she become an ordinary woman, for everyone knew what she had been and what she had supposedly done. Many did not survive the psychological trauma of their fall. Some died from their physical wounds, their bodies unable to recover from the systematic destruction inflicted upon them. Others took their own lives, unable to bear the weight of their transformed existence. Those who lived often became broken shells of their former selves, haunting the edges of Roman society as living reminders of what happened to sacred women who failed to meet impossible standards. The scourging of Vestal virgins served a purpose beyond punishment. It was Rome's way of demonstrating that even the most elevated women remained subject to male authority, that sacredness itself could be stripped away as easily as the white robes that had once marked them as divine. In Rome's darkest hours, when military disasters shattered legions, when plagues swept through the crowded insulae, when earthquakes toppled temples, the empire's leaders sought scapegoats powerful enough to appease the wrath of the gods. Sometimes individual Vestal virgins weren't sufficient. Sometimes Rome demanded mass sacrifice, and multiple sacred priestesses would be condemned to die together in rituals that transform guardians of divine favor into offerings of desperate atonement. These collective executions represented Rome at its most paranoid and calculating. When Hannibal's armies threatened the city's very existence, when Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine, when civil wars tore the empire apart, Roman authorities convinced themselves that their sacred women had somehow failed catastrophically. Perhaps multiple Vestals had broken their vows simultaneously. Perhaps the entire order had been corrupted. Perhaps the gods required a sacrifice of unprecedented magnitude to restore their protection. The logistics of these mass executions revealed the systematic nature of Roman cruelty. Multiple burial chambers would be prepared simultaneously. Teams of officials would coordinate the ceremonies. The condemned Vestals, sometimes 3, occasionally 4, would be processed together, their individual identities subsumed into a collective offering designed to purchase divine forgiveness for Rome's suffering. Imagine the terror of these women as they realized their fate was sealed not by their own actions, but by military defeats they had never influenced, political crises they had never caused, natural disasters they had never precipitated. They were dying not as individuals who had transgressed, but as symbols whose destruction might magically restore Rome's fortunes. The psychological dynamics within these groups of condemned women must have been devastating. Some might blame others for bringing divine wrath upon them all. Others might find solidarity in shared doom. Some would maintain their innocence, while others might confess to imaginary crimes, hoping their admission might spare their sisters. These mass executions served multiple purposes beyond religious appeasement. They demonstrated Rome's commitment to its sacred traditions even in desperate times. They provided the population with visible evidence that their leaders were taking decisive action against divine displeasure. Most importantly, they reinforced the expendability of even the most honored women when Rome's survival seemed at stake. The irony was inescapable. Women whose entire lives had been dedicated to protecting Rome from divine wrath were themselves sacrificed when that protection seemed to fail. Their deaths became the ultimate expression of Rome's theological desperation, the willingness to destroy what they claimed to hold most sacred in hopes of purchasing salvation through blood. The Temple of Vesta eventually fell silent. The eternal flame that had burned for over 1,000 years was finally extinguished, not by the failure of its guardians, but by the collapse of the empire that had created this system of sacred terror. The Vestal virgins passed into history, but their legacy reveals truths about power, purity, and the cost of being elevated beyond humanity. These women lived Rome's greatest paradox, honored as goddesses, yet denied the fundamental right to be human. Their elevated status became their prison, their sacredness, their death sentence. They were simultaneously the most powerful and most vulnerable women in the ancient world, capable of pardoning condemned criminals with a gesture yet unable to save themselves from accusations that could destroy them overnight. The punishments inflicted upon fallen Vestals, burial alive, ritual scourging, mass sacrifice, weren't aberrations of Roman justice. They were its logical conclusion. An empire that conquered through calculated brutality, that built its power on the systematic subjugation of others, inevitably turned that same cruelty upon its own sacred symbols when they failed to meet impossible expectations. The Vestal virgins remind us that the distance between reverence and revulsion, between the sacred and the sacrificed, can be measured in a single accusation, a whispered rumor, a political convenience. Their story echoes through history wherever societies create impossible standards for their most honored members, then destroy them for being human.